I will hit record, and I'm going to quickly do the roll. Attendance isn't that great, but it is better than my 10:30 class was, which, pardon the language, is turning out to be a fucking disgrace.
Yeah, that's silly.
Like this morning in my
I thought these were college students, not kindergartners.
In my 10:30 class, I had to start, I think I had 10 students out of 30. And then not too long after that, I had 8. And then at a certain point, my computer just decided to turn itself off in the middle of the class. And so by the time I recovered and got back into Zoom, there were 3 students. All right, sorry.
What class is it?
Introduction to Philosophy, in which today we're talking about Hegel also, but in connection to the question of selfhood or personal identity. So reading from his Phenomenology of Spirit, which is much less accessible. All right, so I'm going to call your name just to get this attendance taken care of. So let me know if you're here. Jack?
Here.
Sadie? Fia?
Here.
Nehemiah? Joseph? Destery?
Here.
Bennett? Donald? No, Donnie. Wyatt? Justin Gray? Tristan?
Here.
Okay, Sam? Joshua's here. Raven?
Here.
Eva?
Here.
Jackie? Owen?
I'm here.
Brianna?
Here.
Michaela?
Here.
Mac?
Here.
B? Tyler? Kai?
Here.
Kala? James? Micah?
Here.
Megan?
Here.
Ryan?
Here.
Okay. Cool. Oops, we've got Donnie trying to get in.
Just real quickly.
Sure.
When I was doing my reflection, I had my wife come in and like read a page with me, and she like went off on me on like a philosophical understanding of the page, especially about like the archetypes. We talk about like the eagle and the lightning bolt, like that page with the Kant that we did a reflection on. And she like talked to me for like an hour about it. She was like all jazzed on it. Reading one page got her like all livened up and going on, you know, the nature of the world in regards to beauty and art and the mind and consciousness. And it was really cute. It seemed like you should do a philosophy class. She would love it. She's like super into thinking about those things, like way more than I am. And so it was really cool to see her get all livened up by it.
That's cool. That's awesome that you have someone to converse with about these things. All right. Yeah, I see what's going on in the chat here. Right. You are paying for this. It's unusual. Okay. So We're going to talk about Hegel today, but of course there's a lot still to address in connection to Kant, and we never had the opportunity to clarify the focus of the reflection paper last time. And I haven't had the chance yet to take a look at your papers. I'll probably get started on that tomorrow afternoon and grading through those over the next few days. So look forward to that. But we could spend a little bit more time talking about Kant. But I also have a short video I'd like to show. It's about 7 minutes, introducing us to Hegel. And then there's a super fun existential comic on Hegel. And then I, of course, have the reading guide to work through. But one thing maybe we can just turn to is one of those questions from last week's discussion forum. And this is with the aim of achieving some more refined clarity on Kant's formalism and how that stands in contradistinction to the mimetic theory we've examined, and now the romantic conception of art to which we're turning. So one of the questions of last week's discussion forum, and I haven't yet read through all of those discussions yet, so I'm not sure exactly what you might have to say about this, but it had to do with the 18th century, or kind of 18th and 17th century German painter Anna Maria Marian. And so in the secondary textbook, the Gorilla Girls book, this is on page 40 and 40, pages 40 and 41. It talks about her zoological and botanical illustrations. And so one thing we can consider is whether or not, from a Kantian point of view, these illustrations should be understood to be art, works of art, and thus whether they're appropriate objects for the enjoyment of taste, that is, for the recognition or experience of beauty. So hopefully you guys have your text handy, but I can just sort of show you examples of these illustrations, which served a very important role, functional role scientifically, as it contributed to the possible and successful identity and naming and labeling and sort of taxonomical distinctions made between different species, insect species in particular. So what do you think about that? Given what we understand so far about Kant's aesthetic theory, do you suppose we can identify these illustrations as beautiful, that is, as works of art, or not? So how would we go about answering that question? And even if you do, so just to be clear too, even if you do look at these illustrations and derive pleasure from them, you find them enjoyable to look at, that's totally possible, while at the same time disavowing their status as beautiful. So you can say they are agreeable, they are pleasant to look at, they're charming. Kant wouldn't deny any of that. But remember, the designation beautiful carries with it a very explicit and precise sense in accordance with his overarching theory. Yeah, so go ahead. Joshua, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that since like this artist is mirroring, or essentially copying insects and animals and such, like it's kind of more like a rational like illustration, or like a very like precise, nearly scientific illustration, opposed to how Kant would describe as aesthetically beautiful. So, but in terms of like it's mimicking nature, so there is that nature is beautiful, but just starting us out.
Okay. Anybody else want to jump in there? Yeah, Tristan?
I think that it's important to recognize that while it is sort of mimicking nature, it has stylistic decisions in it that go beyond taxonomy or even the natural world. There's some element there of a creative aspect that isn't immediately knowable by just the scientific aspects of things.
Good. That's a really good point, because although Marian is illustrating spiders and other such insects, there are obviously different ways in which one could take on that task. There are different interpretive modes through which an artist would imitate these natural forms. So you can't just say, take, in an abstract sense, a really expert or competent artist, ask them to illustrate insects, and you can be sure that you'll get more or less the same thing. That is to say, we're not dealing with a formulaic or ultimately mechanical process of reproduction. So there is something creative involved. In other words, creative on the part of the person in particular. So there are decisions, there are selections, interpretive moves made on the part of Marian that another artist from another sort of experiential background and worldly milieu would not do, right? Would have made different decisions. And so that's a really important point. So thanks for that, Tristan. So to qualify the mimetic aspect of this just a little bit, it's not, after all, a photograph, but of course, insofar as we understand photography to be an art, even the photographer, although capturing imagistically products of nature or whatever else in an immediate sense, is still making certain decisions through the manner of interpretation. So Owen, did you have something? I saw a little hand show up a moment ago.
Oh yes, I was just going to agree with Tristan and say that, like, as far as what's in this book goes, like, these arachnids and insects aren't being presented in like a purely like neutral light, and in fact we're shown several different scenes of like micro life, which, you know, like, I think that definitely counts as art. And there are like these glimmers of something else beyond the just basic structure of their segmented body parts that sort of hints at a very sublime reality underneath. Like, we're being presented these life forms as something to be considered, but also just as something that is. We can't really dismiss that.
Yeah, so you might not, given that if your only experience with spiders and other such creepy crawlers before was in the corner of your eye, seeing subtly disturbing movement in your house, and if you see the spider in bare illumination, clearly there, you might feel threatened and want to kill it. Well, there is no sort of pleasant remove or distance between you and the object, such to facilitate a more careful and open reflection. Because of course the illustration of the spider, however you might feel about these organisms, is never intuited in your relation to it, observing it as you are, as a real threat. So there is a kind of aesthetic distance that is facilitated by the representation here. But now we have to ask about what the function or purpose of that aesthetic distance is. And so we get a clue, actually, in terms of what Kant might say about this from the Gorilla Girl's own description on page 41. Towards the bottom of the page, they write, "It is considered one of the finest works of botanical illustration ever. Maria died in poverty, but her daughters continued the work she started. Was her work art or science? This reminds us of the question we're always asked. Is Gorilla Girl's work politics or art, given that there's this strong streak of activism in their activities and productions? We hereby declare that all art is art, whether it's scientific, political, or anything else." So on the one hand, there is some clear truth to what the Gorilla Girls are saying. All art is art. But on the other hand, it's tautological, because if we don't exactly understand the logos of what art is, that is, how to define art, or to make sense of our implicit recognition of art when we encounter it in the course of everyday experience, well, then that sentence, all art is art, isn't very helpful, because we're really trying to make sense of what art is in the first place. But that question that preceded the Gorilla Girls' own conclusion, their own response to this, was Marian's work art or science? Well, here we're asking about the purpose of the representation. And so remember, and this is one way that Kant distinguishes how we might derive pleasure from the presence or experience of natural forms or objects versus the creative ends of art. And that is artworks, if they're created by an individual who identifies as an artist, who understands, at least to some extent, what it is they're doing, there's a purpose. So when an artist sits before an easel to prepare a painting, or begins working on a given material to ultimately result in a sculpture, or begins thinking in a free way to create a series of lines of poetry, there is obviously some purpose involved. So we always have to consider purpose, but remember, for Kant, what distinguishes a work of art from another purposeful creation would have to be what brings that particular cultural product into conceptual affinity with the results of natural forces. And so the form at issue is a form of purposiveness. That is, in the case of natural entities, like the beautiful dogwood tree out my window, it's so striking, it is so compelling in its attractiveness that it seems as if not just the botanical or biological entity itself has to have some purpose in terms of life, but the sensuous appearance, so the pattern of colors and other elements that make up the structure or the form that I recognize, it's so perfect, it seems, and exciting my imagination and getting me to think about other things even beyond its presence, that it seems purposive. And so that's really the formal quality that works of human creative poetic effort share with natural works of nature, you could say. There's a kind of purposiveness. But when it comes to works of human art, the purposiveness is what? Well, it's to create art. So you're an artist, you're making a work of art. Why? To make art. And that work of art isn't going to satisfy any determinate need that you have. So if you're hungry, it's not going to sate your appetite. If you're thirsty, it's not going to resolve that sort of discomfort. If you're desirous of status and wealth or whatever else, it's not going to help you in that aim either. So the purposiveness is purely formal. And so you have to examine, to answer this question, what's going on in terms of the representation with regard to the form. And so the form is where you get the purposiveness without the representation, he says, of any given purpose in particular. But if you were to encounter Marion's illustrations in a scientific textbook, say, a work of insect or animal biology or something like that, you would be seeing those illustrations in order to familiarize yourself visually, sensuously, with the determinate forms or morphology that these different species are capable of attaining and propagating through reproduction, and how they stand in terms of being a whole with respect to their parts in various environmental contexts. So you can see then, if you have your book handy, how the insects are negotiating various surfaces, they're crawling over other objects, they're manifesting relationships to each other in the natural world. So then you would be seeing these illustrations as a student of science for didactic purposes, that is to say, for purposes of scientific education. So then you would be seeing these in an effort to learn more about the reality, that is the existence of certain insects. So Marion didn't give us a series of illustrations presenting dragons or unicorns, entities that might be given by an artist a sensuous presentation or appearance, but which in fact do not exist in nature. She's giving us representations of natural objects in order to heighten our intellectual grasp of these beings and how they relate to each other in the natural world more broadly. So then if you're looking at them as a student of nature, as a kind of natural scientific investigator, then however good these drawings are, they're not going to put you in a place where you're experiencing beauty. That is, you're going to see the forms and say, okay, so this is what this species of spider looks like. And I'm noting how it looks quite a bit different from this other species of spider. And so you are getting the material from the sensuous world in order to flesh out, fill in, actualize, render more helpful and concrete the concepts, the sort of categories that you have by which you organize the material world. And once you've done that, you can say, all right, I know about spiders. I know the various varieties of form that these species can take. And I know where they live, how they relate to each other, how they navigate various natural milieus. And then the concept is filled in, it becomes adequate to the educational purpose, and you can close your science book and be done with it. Does that make sense? So in that way, Kant would say, no, these illustrations cannot be considered beautiful. But notice what happens if you don't encounter them in a science book. You don't encounter them in a textbook at all. Maybe you just see a series of her illustrations without any description, any kind of textual preparation for you to understand what you're looking at, just sort of there. You don't know why they were created. You don't know the purpose. And in fact, you have no purpose in coming to examine these drawings. But you simply spend some time with them and say, the form in which these entities are presented, just for my sensuous experience of them, independent of any knowledge I might have, experiential or scientific, that there are things in the world that we call spiders and insects. I might not have ever even heard of a spider, much less seen one, but I can look at these illustrations and just enjoy the pattern or form, the play of contrasting colors, the various magnitudes that are brought into contrast and to proximity with one another. And I can stare at that for quite a long time, perhaps in a similar way to how I look at a tree outside my window or a sunset. And I might think, independently of what these visual forms are representing, I find them a source, I find in them a source of free pleasure. It's a pleasure which doesn't conclude in my learning anything scientific about the world. And it also doesn't conclude in my satisfying any previously motivating desire, such as hunger or thirst, or the need for sexual activity, or social relationship or correspondence or something like that. I have no lack or need, which now the experience of these sensuously presented patterns and forms are satisfying. Yet I see them and I derive a source of pleasure. Well, in that kind of innocent relating to these illustrations, one might, in that regard, consider them, even by Kantian lights, beautiful. So then it really depends on the subjective conditions in which you are coming to apprehend and make sense of the sensuous forms given to you, either from nature or the artist. Right? Does that make sense? So if I say these,
that was awesome, thank you.
Yeah, so if I say these illustrations are good, remember those formal categories or concepts that we were working with before from Kant. So if I say these illustrations are good, well, I need to take some time to qualify what I mean by that, because I can mean that they're good in as much as they adequately represent external nature by giving us a clear picture of what these insect forms can be and the kind of relations and possibilities in which they can give shape to their continued existence. So if I say that, well then they're conceptually good. They're good because they're adequate to the concept of insect, of animal life, of zoology, or whatever. Or I mean, obviously this doesn't work with spiders, but with like, you can imagine, because we talk about the culinary arts as in some way a kind of fine art. So the most masterful chefs, for example, are very much attuned to the visual, that is sensuous appearance, and not just sensuous. There's the olfactory, so the smell and so forth, that plays into a presentation of food that's understood as important independently of what happens when you put it in your mouth and consume it. But if I look at a plate of food and I say, that looks like a good plate of food, just like I did with these spider drawings, I have to be clear about what I mean. Is it good in that conceptually, I have an idea of what food is. This stuff in front of me seems pretty proximal. It comes close at least to the idea of food, therefore it's good. Or I can look at it and say, that looks like a good plate of food because I've eaten things that are similar before. They give me great pleasure. So I'm anticipating gratification, satisfying my sensuous desires. But I can, on the other hand, there's this third possibility that Kant holds open. I can look at that plate of food and say it's good in that, just in virtue of the sensuous array and relationship between the parts that make up the totality of the meal. So the interplay of colors and the play of presence and absence and so forth, how the food makes up or takes up the space of the plate. I can say there's something beautiful about that, independently of my desire to eat it, and also, importantly, independently of the robust concepts that I have about what food is and what counts or what can qualify as a legitimate instance of food. So does that make some sense of what's going on in Kant's theory and why we're using this label formalism? Versus,
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're sharing about, like, essentially, like, it's good in that, like, your experience of the form elicits like a sense of wellness in yourself, and that in itself is beautiful, or something like
yeah,
that.
it's a sense of wellness that's immediate, in that the pleasure comes from the experience of the aesthetic object. That is to say, temporality is left out because you're not looking at the sandwich as a presaging act to eventually eating the sandwich, such that when you look at it, you're anticipating the fulfillment that you'll derive from its consumption. So the pleasure that you get from looking at a beautiful form is in that sense immediate, but it's also in another important sense beyond immediacy, because there is no ultimate concept that you can turn to conclude the whole affair, to wrap it up nicely. And that's why you can continue to look at a beautiful sunset or a beautiful flower or a beautiful painting, or listen to a beautiful piece of music over and over again. Whereas if you're just trying to learn a basic scientific fact, that's not something you would do, because the good of learning the fact, once you have achieved the knowledge, it's behind you and you can move on to something else. But there's something about our cognitive powers and how they're put to work. We're in the presence of beauty that is never terminated. It's never finalized. And it's for that reason that our imagination is driven to this act of a open-ended free play, where as long as we're engaged in that moment, we experience this kind of pleasure. And in that sense, it's a free pleasure. It's free in that it's not tied with any particular inclinations that I have as an individual that might be different for you. And it's also not tied to any concept which we have that helps us to organize the world through the sort of procedures that we're familiar with in natural science. Okay, Owen, did you have something to add?
Yes, I'm just rather taken by this idea of the culinary arts as a distinction between just food. And I was wondering if, like, I don't know, wine tasting would be an example of something being pretty much within the realm of trying to find what's beautiful as such in like wine. And if so, where lies the distinction, or what disconnects it from just the bare, like, stomach growling, like, pleasure seeking that food sort of is defined by?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Kant himself, as we've seen, doesn't talk about the culinary arts. So I imagine, and Kant does talk about, he talks about wine, right, a couple times. But he never talks about wine as a candidate for the judgment beauty, as a legitimate candidate for taste in the sense of aesthetic judgment, rather than taste as a matter of sensuous bodily response to some, whether it's food stuff or sounds or even colors. So I don't think Kant would consider sommelier, for example, as artists, at least in the way that he would identify painters as artists, or sculptors and so forth, and the other fine arts, as Hegel lays these out for us for our reading. But I'm not sure he's right about that, right? So we can challenge that point of view, we can contest that. But for our reading, as we continue with Hegel for next time, he makes, and it's similar to this point, he says that there cannot, so when it comes to Hegel, and I think that Kant would agree with this, our olfactory sense, so the sense of smell, is incapable of tapping into, as he puts it, the wellspring of beauty. So beautiful objects do not show up as beautiful in relation to our olfactory sense. So an object can only be understood or apprehended, experienced, judged as beautiful in virtue of the deployment of our visual sense or our auditory sense. And that might be exclusively, as we'll see, the case for Hegel. And so we might be able to make sense of Kant's kind of prejudice when it comes to excluding gustatory materials or olfactory materials as legitimate candidates for the judgment of beauty. But what is it about, so of course, through our eyes, we can experience and enjoy the forms of painting, of sculpture, theatrical performances, dance, and so forth. And through our ears, we can experience the pleasures of music. But what do these sense modalities, so sight and hearing, what do they have in common that something like smell and taste and touch lack?
I think we're far more able to get information out of those senses than from, or at least like cognitive information from our eyes and our ears, whereas it's kind of difficult to get anything else beyond like instinctual response from the more dull senses, like this, the touch and the smell.
Yeah, so exactly. And so you mentioned cognitive information. And so all the way back to Aristotle, and this is what he says at the beginning of his work, Metaphysics, that all human beings desire to know. And this is why humans, regardless of what they're seeking, regardless of what aims, goals, or desires they have, they take pleasure in their senses, and they take pleasure in their visual senses, the capacity to see more than anything else. And so it's through the visual sense that we're able to make fine-tuned distinctions between objects and the environment in such a way that is not possible if we're dealing with purely tactile contact with phenomena or objects, or smell or the gustatory sense. So for example, if you try to rely on only your nose, so if you're, say, blind and you have the unfortunate task of picking up your dog's poop in your yard and you're trying to follow it just with your sense of smell, you're going to have a very difficult time doing that. Because there's something about our sense of smell, which doesn't give us spatial orientations. And the same goes less obviously for our auditory sense, that is our hearing. So I had this experience in the last house I lived in when I lived in, it was a couple years ago when I was living in Phoenix before it burned down. And I was right by the high school. And standing in the backyard, I could hear like the marching band and so forth going on at the high school. But since I was behind my house, which was behind the school, I wasn't able to see the school. So I wasn't able to see exactly from where the sounds were deriving, so their spatial origin. So all I could rely on were my ears. And from my limited point of view, the sound seemed to be coming from a place in front of me, that is from the western direction, when I knew intellectually they were coming from the east. So it's really only by putting to work together our visual sense with our auditory sense that our sense of sound can really give us any kind of spatial directedness. So if you're dealing with just touch, it's hard to pick apart where one being or entity in your environment begins and ends and gives way to a different being in the environment. So there isn't, to put it very simply, there just isn't enough information given in the material constitution of things as communicated to us through non-visual, non-auditory sensations. And so another aspect is when it comes to the sense of taste, we are incapable of teasing apart what is purely subjective from, let's say, the objective character of the material that we're tasting. So I'm sure you guys have had the experience of being sick, for example, or when you have the flu or a cold or something like that, you might eat your favorite food or drink your favorite beverage, but it tastes different than you're accustomed to. And so you're not really able, just using that sense in itself, your sense of taste, to detect specific aspects or features of the very thing that you're tasting, and to clearly disentangle those aspects, let's call them objective properties or qualities, from what it is that you as a subject are introducing to that experience. Whereas it's much easier to do that when it comes to visual experiences or auditory experiences too. So that could be some reasoning as well as to why it's really those privileged senses, the senses of sight and hearing, that are uniquely capable of producing the kind of aesthetic pleasure that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think with taste and smell and things like that, I think it's meant to be exclusive in the sense that, like smells have a lot to do with like, choosing a mate and finding your own species and your own kind of like, I guess, composition of people that you're resonant with. Like smells and taste have like that aspect. So I think it's supposed to be very between people, what smells good and what doesn't, and etc. So biologically.
Yeah, and also, so I mean, that's a good point. And I was going to say too that there's something openly intellectual about your visual experience of phenomena and your auditory experience of phenomena. And this is where aesthetic distance enters into the picture as well, that stands in stark contrast from what happens in the case of the gustatory or the tactile. So I'm sure we've all had this experience too of coming into a public space and just being sort of violently assaulted by someone's body odor or some other horrific scent that you can't quite pin down.
I hate Ashland.
Exactly, it's an everyday experience in Ashland. You're trying to navigate the complex potpourri of body odor and patchouli and whatever else. But
I mean, that's the thing too. Back then, there's just people smelled bad, so it's like you won't really want to go there.
Yeah, and so in connection to that, this important 19th century, early 20th century German philosopher and sociologist Georg Simmel talks about the social, political, or sociological effects of these sense modalities, such that if you are of the upper classes, for example, and you feel sympathy for the poor, for the marginalized, for the oppressed, you might be motivated to enter into their communities and to see how they suffer, and to philanthropically give to alleviate that suffering, to help the community and so forth. So they're very, let's say, if you're quite rich and privileged, you go to a poor neighborhood, you're mingling, as it were, with the unwashed masses. You can nevertheless achieve some intellectual distance. You can say, oh, these people, they look gross. I hate their clothes. Their hair doesn't look good. Their houses are shitty. But you can compensate for that intellectually and still go about your ethical business. But the smell, Zimmel points out, can really stand in the way of that accommodation. There's something visceral that you can't just intellectually smooth over when it comes to something like the smell. You can't just say, oh yeah, these people smell terrible, but they're all right, I'll help them. There's something that pushes you away, right? You want to escape, and there's nothing that you can do in terms of putting your will out there based on your desire to help, to overcome the noxiousness of that encounter, right? So there's something about what's given to us, what's communicated to us through senses like touch and smell, that we can't intellectually get around, that we can't accommodate in virtue of the categories we can supply through our structures of consciousness.
And conversely, if someone smells amazing, there's no resisting them.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, why do you think people, I mean, there's so much money in perfumes and so forth, and you can buy like pheromones that are supposed to unconsciously attract people to you and so forth, because in that way we are charmed by these lures in our environment, and that very word can put us in a place to understand what Kant would say about this. Materials which give us or communicate themselves to us largely through the sense of smell or touch can be charming, right? So you might feel a textile, you might feel a garment like velvet, and it'll be very nice and you'll want to keep touching it, right? Or if you have a dog or a cat with a nice luxurious coat, you want to keep touching them. Kant would say that that experience is aesthetic in some measure, insofar as it involves sensuousness, and it is pleasant. You're getting some kind of gratification from it. But here's where Kant's kind of formalist bias or prejudice comes in. He would say that experience of something that's tactily charming cannot, strictly speaking, be beautiful. And I think his reasoning there is because although it's a source of pleasure when you're touching that surface, and this is something that Owen mentioned, so cognitive in the way of knowledge, you're not able through your sense of touch to see the pattern or formal structure in which the parts that make up the whole of the object you're experiencing work together, play together. So more of a distance is necessary or involved. And so you can really do that in a powerful and eminently successful way through your eyes, right? Through your visual sense modality. You can stand away from something and see it in its wholeness, in its totality, which, remember, according to Aristotle, is needed for the proper experience of beauty. You need to be able to see it as a whole. And then using Kant now, you need to be able to see how, as a whole, the parts make up the whole, and how each part plays a functional role in a necessary sense, vis-a-vis the constitution of the formal structure which you're judging as beautiful because you're deriving this kind of free pleasure from it. And so this is where the sensus communis comes in, right? So that's where the common sense comes in. So that's why, according to Kant, normatively speaking, since we're both rational subjects capable of the judgment of beauty, we should both be able to see a tree or a sunset or a piece of sculpture or a painting and come to agreement that it is beautiful, regardless of the idiosyncratic interests and desires that we have that separate us as people. Because when you try to see something as beautiful, what are you exactly capturing? Well, it can't be the colors, It can't be the texture, right? It can't be the particular sound. If you're listening to a piece of music, it's not this this saxophone note that you hear that's beautiful, right? It's not the sound of the guitar. It's not this hitting of the snare drum that's beautiful. Those are individual sounds which can be appealing or charming or disturbing, as the case may be. But it's really the structural whole, the interplay of these parts and manifold dimensions that excite the free cognitive powers of the understanding and the imagination and yield the peculiar sensation that you judge as beautiful. So then we would all come to agreement, because you have eliminated from the possible judgment of beautiful anything that we could possibly disagree about, right? So the sounds, the colors, the textures, and what are you left with? Well, in one sense, these kind of abstract forms, which don't point to any particular existence. So yeah, does that make sense? Kant's theory?
Yeah, would this be example like, so like back when I was a homeless free roaming hippie, I used to sun gaze in the morning and the evening. And I was like, wow, it's pretty cool that like pretty much every human experienced the sun. And so it's like having that experience connected to this and like with the beauty of the natural beauty of the sun, like that experience of being connected to people across the world and through time gave a sense of nostalgia that I experienced as beauty.
Yeah, that's right. That's a huge part of that judgment and experience. So perceiving the sunset somehow motivates you to think, this is beautiful. The thought just consumes your entire perceptual moment. And in that moment, in that grip, you can think, even if this doesn't occur explicitly, that others in the world are sharing this precise experience, which isn't bound up with anything individual, anything idiosyncratic, that is anything that separates them from you. So in that way, by perceiving simultaneously with others, indeterminate others, wherever they might be around the world, perceiving that sunset as beautiful, you are putting yourself into the role of universal humanity, gaining a picture of what makes you the same as everyone else, despite the fact that you are obviously in other respects quite different. Okay, so does that make sense? Any final questions about Kant? And again, so looking forward to next week. There's no new material we're introducing. Next week is the midterm paper, but we're still going to meet. So I think in the syllabus, or maybe on Moodle, I said we're not going to meet on Tuesday, but I'll make it optional. So I'll be there on or Thursday, Thursday next week. So we'll still have class and we can continue talking about these things. So we can pursue questions that are still remaining and wrap up any loose ends, tie up these remaining kind of threads and so forth next week. But for now, are there any final comments or questions about Kant? And so I encourage, if you haven't done it already, to spend some time looking at the lecture notes, those slides, the reading guide that I put on for Kant. So that could help you as you're preparing, of course, for the midterm paper. Okay. So before we take a small break and then jump into Hegel, I'm going to share first the Existential Comic. And for those who have taken Intro to Philosophy with me, you might have read this comic before. And then we're going to watch a brief video on Hegel that's offered through the School of Life YouTube series. And they have a number of these short videos on historical philosophers. And some of them are pretty good. The Hegel one, I think, is quite good in a number of ways. There's one for Kant, it's terrible. So I don't recommend you looking at the one for Kant, it'll lead you astray. The one for Nietzsche that we'll look at in a couple weeks is so-so. So yeah, we'll look at that. But first, let's pull up this Existential Comic. So this comic doesn't tell us anything about Hegel's aesthetic theory, but it does tell us about the dialectical logic, which, according to Hegelian metaphysics, drives the teleological unfolding of history. So we'll just take a few minutes to read through these panels together and let me know if I'm going too fast. So already in this first series of panels, there's an implicit dig against Kant. So pure reason. So if you recall, the first of Kant's major critical works is the Critique of Pure Reason. That's referred to otherwise as the first critique. And here we find an implicit dig against Thomas Hobbes and the whole social contract tradition, including figures like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and also Kant. So Kant was at sort of the concluding and just the kind of concluding end of that tradition.
Is the guy in the brown Kant or Hegel?
Oh, this guy, oh, that's Hegel. Yeah.
That's Hegel. Okay. All right. So normally at this point in the comic, the writer of the comic will explain the joke. But here he says, "What, are you expecting me to explain Hegel here? You are a fool. No one can explain Hegel except for Hegel, and even he can't explain it." Okay. All right. So hopefully that made some sense to you guys. I think it's a funny comic. But let me pull up now the short video. But I'm going to pause the recording. So, any thoughts or questions about that short video? Have you read much of Hume's books? Like, have you read those books? Have you read the books like the Philosophy of Spirit?
Oh yeah, the Phenomenology of Spirit. Got this beautiful text right next to me here. It's a veritable tome, you can see. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Hegel scholar. The 19th century isn't exactly my area of expertise, but I'm familiar with Hegel, painfully familiar, and in some ways. But yeah, were there any points of confusion that need clarifying from the video, or did that help to make sense of his project and where art in particular finds its role in there?
Well, yeah, he's just saying it's like not like it's not necessarily secondary to primary duties of life. Like it's very important to existence and everything, essentially.
Yeah, it's one of the foundational institutions at the conceptual level from which the more familiar concrete institutions that we're familiar with now are possible in the first place. And so art played an essential role in the advancement or evolution of religious traditions and practices even. And so one thing he notes about the art of ancient Greece, for example. So what we talked about in the context of Aristotle, it's through the theatrical or poetic form of tragedy that the individual subject, given that it's the individual in tragic performances that are not just narrating events that unfold in history, but are acting them out with pathos, that is, with personified emotion, with a lived concrete experience. It's through that kind of development out of the epic in which the hero, for example, was simply diegetically characterized. So in ancient Greek art, in theater in particular, poetry, there's a distinction between mimesis and diegesis. So diegesis translates roughly to narrative or narration, such that we find in, say, Homer's Iliad or Odyssey. Whereas in tragedy, it's not simply a story told from a universal perspective. It's this or that individual subject exemplifying their personalities, manifesting themselves in time through emotional deliverances and presentations. And so it's at that point that individual subjectivity gets developed within the broader context of a kind of religious community that was already laid out and articulated in broad strokes in terms of the stories that were told. And so it's through the development of different art forms, in this case, different forms of poetry or theater, that religious life and the character of the individual within the sort of community that a religious orientation is manifested in is possible. And so art, you could say then, prepares or sets up a world, the very world that we come to inhabit and see ourselves reflected back to ourselves in. Okay, so let's take a quick break, just 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and we'll continue our conversation on Hegel. Sound good, everybody? All right, so I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Okay. So before I jump to the slides, to the reading guide, because this notion of romanticism or the category of the romantic is quite obscure and open to a multitude of differing interpretations. So the kind of vocabulary that we're using can be quite confusing. So we don't want to lump Hegel into someone who would, given the chance, be an aficionado of like Sandra Bullock rom-coms or something. That's not the sense of romantic or romanticism that we're working with here. But can anyone, just based on the reading and whatever limited familiarity we have with Hegel's philosophy so far, give us a sense of what the concept of the romantic is doing in its place in this theory? So why, in other words, are we referring to Hegel's approach to art as the romantic theory or romantic conception of art?
Is it because he doesn't see it as like so practical? And I forget how he puts it, but he puts it as like art is like the like purest form of the mind or something like that, like the highest idea or like interpretation that you can achieve.
Yeah, well, it's at several places in our reading, though, he pushes back against that to some extent and says, among these major categories through which spirit presents itself in history, art is of serious importance, but compared to the domains of philosophy and science and even religion, he thinks it's the lowest. But it's still quite elevated. So only philosophy and religion would be higher in terms of the advent or self-showing through history of Geist or spirit. And a quick, just a shorthand way to make sense of spirit or Geist, as Hegel uses this idea, it's an I that is at the same time a we, and a we that is at the same time an I. So that's why institutions, which can transcend particular historical moments and even generational, multi-generational lives. So imagine, for example, a courthouse that's been standing and practicing, so operating in the domain of law, jurisprudence for hundreds of years. There are many generations that have come and gone and have pursued trials and so forth in that context, but the institution still remains. So art is a major institution, and it, as a conceptual institution, gives rise to concrete practical institutions that we're familiar with, like museums, academies, galleries, art schools, and so forth. So to further the question, though, we might similarly ask what is it about philosophy? What is it about science? What is it about religion that can be understood from a romantic point of view? Does that make sense as a question? So in other words, what I'm saying is, if his theory of art is called romantic, his theory that extends as a systematic approach to metaphysics, to other domains of human experience and thought, would also be romantic. So what work is this idea of the romantic doing?
Well, I mean, Hegel says like beauty is like the sensual form of the idea, or like the sensuous form of the idea. And so it's kind of like the nature of attraction, and he defines in some ways like beautiful, and he goes on to say like fine art is not art in the true sense of the term until it is thus free, and the highest function is only then satisfied when it has established itself in the sphere which it shares with religion, philosophy, becoming thereby merely one mode and form through which the divine, the profoundest interests of mankind, and spiritual truths of the widest range are brought home to consciousness and expressed. So
Good. Perfect. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to call our attention to a passage just a little bit down in the same paragraph as a moment of the text that I think encapsulates in a powerful way what Romanticism means for our purposes. But to go back to what Brianna was saying, though, so she mentioned that art is this kind of vehicle for the highest articulation or expression of mind or consciousness. But we push back a little bit on that, because compared to religion and philosophy or science, Hegel would say it's a little bit lower. But in any case, those are the only two domains that surpass it in this power or capacity. But think about then, what is so we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about mind or spirit. What would then be the contrasting or opposing medium or term or source? So mind or consciousness or spirit versus what? What does Hegel set up as the opposition?
untrue and deception.
No, not here. That's not what I'm thinking of.
Talking about nature?
Yeah, nature or materiality, sensuousness. And so good. So what is it about the domains of these categories or institutions of the human spirit, such as art, science and philosophy, and religion? What do these kinds of domains of human reality and experience make possible vis-a-vis the confrontation of mind and nature, the encounter of mind and nature? We'll go down a little bit on the page. And so this will, I think, help us to make sense of Romanticism, which is a particular kind of approach to the aesthetic that emerged out of the 19th century. And so in our textbook, Schelling is another major progenitor of Romanticism and art. And I encourage you, if you have the inclination and free time, to check that out later on. Schelling's really cool. But so down on that page, this is 388 in our textbook, towards the bottom of the page, Hegel writes, let's see, but the mind is able to heal the fracture which is thus created in its progression. From the wealth of its own resources, it brings into being the works of fine art as the primary bond of mediation between that which is exclusively external, sensuous, and transitory, and the medium of pure thought, between nature and its finite reality and the infinite freedom of a reason which comprehends. So just, I'll give you a quick, simple vignette to make sense of what he's suggesting here. So imagine you're walking around in an open and free environment. Your reverie is taking you wherever you might go. Now there's this boulder that's standing in your way. It's an obstruction to your path. The boulder, in its sheer positivity, its sheer material presence, serves as a check on your will, right? You want to keep going in this straight path. The boulder is standing in your way. The boulder is a product of material nature. And as such, it shares in no consciousness of its own. It's simply there. It enjoys unadulterated self-coincidence and identity. There is simply the boulder. The boulder is not experiencing any dissatisfaction with itself. It doesn't dream at night about writing romantic novels. It's just there, obstructing your path. You encounter this product of nature, and you encounter it as an expression of your own negation, right? So your consciousness previous to this moment is free, unobstructed. In fact, you in some measure are precisely as far as the horizon permits. So you're seeing 100 yards from you, you see a hill, a beautiful tree on the hill. In some measure, to the extent that your consciousness is conscious of, your consciousness apprehends these objects in its unfolding, you are identical with these things. You have possessed them. But now this boulder is denying your advancement. The boulder is saying no to you. The boulder then presents itself as not you. So there is you, and then there is this foreign, alien otherness, this pure, impenetrable materiality that will not accommodate you, and in fact manifests as a sort of meaninglessness. You haven't made a space in your own understanding or consciousness for this particular presence. It is simply a denial. It's a no. Now, let's say you're an artist and you bust out a chisel and a series of other implements, and you go to work on the boulder and you reveal a form that you might think was sleeping within it. So you reveal the form of, say, a horse. You chisel out, however successfully, effectively, beautifully, or primitively, you're able to accomplish this. You chisel out the sensuous appearance of a horse. Well, now you have sort of infused the very being of this purely material, natural object, which stands in the capacity of a negation of your own consciousness, of your own will. You have now mingled your consciousness. You have now imposed your spirit upon this brute and mute material presence, thereby expanding your own being. You have somehow put your consciousness in this being, and through that, you have overcome the alienation that you first encountered that takes the shape of the separation between who you are in your consciousness and what this rock presents, right? So you have appropriated material nature, which was previously pure otherness. You have appropriated it, which means making it in some way you, making it yourself. And so you have, as he puts it, healed the fracture. You have healed the gap between yourself as pure consciousness and material nature in which, as an environment, you come to find yourself as pure consciousness. And so it's through art that we can heal this gap or this fracture, which is a series, or excuse me, a source of pleasure or inadequacy or dissatisfaction. And so art can thus advance consciousness in such a way that, historically speaking, it advances universal spirit through bridging the gap between consciousness as intersubjectivity, human life, human spirit, and the material nature that that consciousness comes to manipulate and perceive itself in as reflecting back to itself. So that's really at the heart of Hegel's romantic theory here. And this is, although we didn't get into this metaphysical aspect of Kant, in some way a reaction to Kantian transcendental idealism. So according to Kant, and this is a part of Kant's representational theory, according to Kant, and we talked a little bit about this, everything that we know about the world, everything that we experience out the world is the result of the mediation that's performed by these categories or concepts that our cognitive structure, which he identifies as the understanding, imposes as a principle of regulation and organization. So there is something beyond us, but what that is, we can't possibly ever come to know, according to Kant. That's what he calls the in itself, the thing in itself. So right now, I have this book in front of me. There is some sensory manifold that's beyond my own mind that enters into my consciousness from my various sense modalities. But the moment that happens, the categories or concepts that make up the structure of my understanding, which as a human subject, I share with all of you, we all have the same basic cognitive blueprint. The category of space, time, organizes it in such a way that I can see the book in front of me in contrasting relief from the table on which it's sitting, from the cell phone that's next to it. For Kant, space and time don't exist out there in the world as products of nature. Space and time exist as formal principles in our consciousness by which material nature is organized and made sense of, rendered intelligible for us. And other important categories beyond space and time would be substance. So we learned from David Hume that we never encounter substances out in the world. This book is in front of me, and I take it to be an external object, but really its externality is given to me in the form of an impression, a sensory impression. I have a visual impression of the form, I have a tactile impression of the pages and so forth, and I can never disentangle my experience of this book in the course of these nested impressions from some external substance, right? And so Kant builds on that insight and says, well, the very idea of an external reality independent of my mind is just a category that my mind, whether I want to or not, imposes on the stuff that comes to me from outside and makes sense of it, right? But Hegel responds to this. So everything that we encounter then for Kant is a phenomenon. And a phenomenon, drawing on the ancient Greek etymology, is simply that which appears. So we're only dealing with appearances for Kant. And appearances are made up of this indeterminate sensory manifold about which I can say absolutely nothing because I have no access to it in itself, on the one hand, and then the categories of my understanding that go to work organizing that material. So everything that appears, that we can judge, whether aesthetically or cognitively, that we can do work on as scientists or technicians or whatever, is only appearances, right? So Hegel, part of what motivates his approach here, his romantic turn, is to try to heal the fracture between ourselves as consciousness and, from Kant's transcendental idealistic point of view, a material world that we can never come to know. So Hegel wants to sort of heal or repair that separation, to put us, as it were, back into the world from which we're separated by consciousness. And art is one of the means through which that can happen historically. So that stone, that rock I was telling you about, that is a purely foreign, alien being that's outside of your consciousness, limiting you, through art, you can manipulate it, impose your spirit upon it, and thereby, at the same time, take that rock and make it like you, and take you and make yourself like that rock, given that you're putting yourself into it in the form of a final sculpture or something like that. Does that make sense?
I guess relating to like, we're reading Kant for last week.
Yeah.
It's like, just kind of really quickly, I'm pretty occupied with maintaining the basic substance of my life. And like, I think if I were channeling my life in more of an artistic fashion, that I would have both more abundance and then also more higher quality of life. So I think like, that healing of like not being like a rigid stone, but then actually bringing that consciousness to the stone and shaping it to bring myself into my life, opposed to just trying to like find a way to move the boulder, So anyways, that's how I interpret it interpersonally.
Yeah, if you just jump over the boulder or somehow kick it aside.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
If you're strong enough to do so, well, even if it's no longer in your path, it's still over there. It's still over there as not you, somehow antagonizing you. There's this thing, this otherness that doesn't reflect you back to yourself, that bothers you. But as an artist, you can take that, impose your will on it, manifest your spirit within its materiality, and put you in it and put it in you, and thereby massage, if not heal, the gap that ultimately separates you. So that's kind of what he means by the romantic. Okay. So we don't need to read through all of this. So we got some sense of his biography before, but it is worth noting his final words. So just shortly after he was named rector at the University of Berlin in 1829, he died pretty abruptly of cholera or some similar illness. And supposedly his last words were, "There is only one man who ever understood me, and even he didn't understand me." So those were Hegel's tragic last words. So we talked already about some of this, but he's the most famous figure in the German idealist tradition, which includes Fichte, Schelling, who's included in our textbook, Jacobi, and Schlegel. And this school of thought or movement in philosophy emerged in the wake of Kant as an effort, and this is where Romanticism, the 19th century, comes from, to repair that fracture between pure consciousness or pure reason and some unknowable, unnameable external nature. And so this is what's referred to now in what Hegel provides for us, absolute idealism. It's absolute in that it repairs through this historical mediation, the process of the dialectic, any negativity, any absence, any lack. It all gets made sense of in terms of a functional role and the overarching teleological unfolding of spirit as such. And so it's through this process, which is a kind of rational process, and it unfolds through the medium of history towards the final realization of absolute spirit, which it's worth noting for Hegel actually happened already in the 19th century. So he thought really at his time, spirit had come to fulfill itself. But in that fulfillment of spirit, these dualisms of mind, matter, nature, spirit, subject, and object are overcome. So these distinctions or discrepancies are resolved. And this would culminate, according to Hegel, in universal freedom. And so this is a system I just named absolute idealism. And so a couple things about the dialectic. This historical process, which is called spirit, sometimes translated from Geist to mind, it's dialectical. And so this is a dynamic sort of process of opposition, a kind of dynamic play of oppositions, tripartite, in other words, three-part or three-term. And so thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Very quickly, we can use the example of American chattel slavery to make sense of this. So the institution of slavery in our own country's history, let's say that that is the first move in this dialectic, which happens historically. That's the thesis. That's a certain state of affairs or condition of reality. Now, of course, at the time, there was the Abolitionist Movement. So from the very beginning, there are those who opposed on moral grounds slavery as essentially unethical and unsustainable. So this abolitionist response, this demand to dismantle slavery, would be then, within the dialectical structure, the antithesis. So it's the opposition to the state of affairs, which is the thesis. Now, through this relation of opposition between the thesis and then the antithesis, the third term of the dialectic emerges, the synthesis, the Aufheben, which is sometimes translated as supplanting, overcoming, sublating, or canceling. But canceling is a little misleading, which in terms of this synthesis, while preserving certain aspects of the previous two terms in its struggle, it stands as a new thesis because it hasn't simply ended there. And so using this example, we might name the thesis that emerges from the synthesis of the previous two terms now the civil rights movement of the 20th century. So the process then begins anew because not every problem has been worked out, which means there has to be a new antithesis, which will give rise to a new synthesis, which nevertheless preserves some of the terms of the previous development. And so the three domains of spirit in which this happens, and it always happens through the replacement of one historical period with another, would be art, religion, and philosophy. And that's why we can have a history of art, a history of religion, and a history of philosophy that would map or track this trajectory. And so for Hegel, philosophy, and we would include science, and that would constitute its highest development. So Hegel is the most important philosopher to emerge since the 19th century, exercising a powerful influence on a hugely diverse array of cultural traditions and movements, including Marxism, strangely, fascism, liberalism, existentialism, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and even critical race theory. So all of that is to some extent derived from Hegelian metaphysics, Hegelian, let's say, logic of being. Okay. So this is just a description of the major works that Hegel published during his lifetime. So the Phenomenology of Spirit, it's that 600-page tome that I showed you earlier, but it's an account of the evolution of consciousness from immediate sense perception to the other end of this unfolding, absolute knowing. And so derived from the Greek, phenomenology literally means the logos of that which appears. So it's the rigorous investigation into the appearing or coming into presence of, well, for Hegel's purposes, spirit or Geist, self-consciousness. Then there's the Science of Logic, which is a 3-volume treatise on the dialectical logic that powers as the sort of essential mechanism that's motivating and putting to work the narrative that he presents in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And so this is that mechanism that I described previously of dynamic opposition, by which what are previously abstract dualisms, so there's the subject and the object, there's spirit and nature, or culture and nature. So maybe a more helpful way too, just to mention this, to make sense of spirit, or Geist and Hegel, is to talk about culture. So for Hegel, culture or spirit is a kind of second nature. And so when Hegel talks about nature reduplicating or duplicating itself through one's consciousness, that is through a spirit, that's what he's talking about. So nature is immediate, and then through culture, we can respond and build on that immediacy. So mediate it in various ways. But these dualisms through that are resolved into concrete unities, such that you no longer see a real difference between subject and object, nature and culture, and so forth. And then in Elements of the Philosophy of Right, we see Hegel's effort in social and political philosophy. And this is where he argues for the role of cultural institutions, the essential role in these institutions as transgenerational for preserving, instantiating, and communicating and evolving certain truths, preserving them, instantiating them, communicating them, and so forth. And so in the lectures on aesthetics, and these were published after Hegel's death. These were published in 1835. And these are taken from various volumes on Hegel's Philosophy of the Fine Arts and Aesthetics, which he gave in a lecture series at Heidelberg and Berlin between 1818 and 1829. And so we're only reading selections from the introduction to this huge multi-volume series. Okay. So the central claim, so I have it highlighted in yellow here, the central claim running through the lectures on aesthetics is that works of art make explicit in sensuous form the fundamental truths in a given historical epoch. And so we can identify then art history as a repository of such truths, documenting the progress of, in Hegel's language, world historical process, spirit towards its end in absolute freedom and self-consciousness. So as was mentioned in that video, and this is something that comes out in different moments of our reading too, according to Hegel, if you really want to understand the character or personality, in other words, the spirit of a historical people, of a culture which is no longer living, which is past, well, you look at their art, and the art can serve as a kind of aperture or a lens through which to make sense of the essential characteristics of that no longer living kind of life of consciousness, historical now life of consciousness. It's dead in concreteness. It's dead in experiential reality or the progress of time, but it's nevertheless kept going in the art that's representative in each case of a particular age, such that art cannot be neatly disconnected from the age that produced it. Okay, so this is the last thing we'll get to talk about, but Hegel thinks of beauty as, and this is how he defines it, you might say, beauty is truth made vivid in sensuous form. And there are different ways, largely when you're turning to the other, especially science or philosophy, major modes of spirits coming to self-consciousness. There are other ways, non-sensuous ways, that this truth comes to manifest. But here in art, we're dealing with the sensuous appearance of truth. So for Hegel, the history of art is the evolutionary history of this function becoming more adequate to itself and reaching its limit. And Hegel thinks, and this is known by scholars as the death of art thesis. Hegel thinks at this point in the 19th century, the institution of art has really reached its full possibility. It's reached its limit, so now it's only surpassed by religion and especially philosophy and science. But Hegel divides this history into three essential epochs, and so the next three slides lay those out, each representing a different relationship between some ideal content, that is, what is given in pure reflective consciousness, independent of any environment or material production. So the relationship between some ideal content and then the sensuous or imaginative form through which it is expressed. So each of these different epochs, the later ones coming to replace, transcend, or supplant the previous ones, represent a different mode of that relationship between the ideal and the sensuous. So in symbolic art, represented mostly by architecture, and this is a quotation from the book from 380, the ideal content is less than sensuous imaginative material can express. So here, sensuous materiality exceeds ideality. So the content is weak compared to what gets manipulated in the final material form. And then in classical art, represented by ancient Greek sculpture, for example, the ideal content reaches the highest level that sensuous imaginative material, whether we're talking about words in poetry, stone, or other such materials for sculptural productions, paint and canvas for paintings. So the ideal content here reaches the highest level that sensuous imaginative material can concretely express. So in classical art, sensuous materiality and ideality are fully commensurate. They're adequate to each other. And again, sculpture is paradigmatic of this. And then lastly, romantic art. This is post-Christian art, let's say. The ideal content is so evolved that it now contains more than any sensuous imaginative material can express. Here, ideality exceeds sensuous materiality. So there's something about the thought, there's something about the way spirit is working itself out in the consciousness of the artist that surpasses what's possible in any material substratum that that artist can manipulate through the realization of the ideal. And so the most essential romantic arts, and these are to be taken in ascending order of importance. So first least important, and then the last being of the highest: painting, music, and poetry. And so you can see then how each of them, and if you proceed along the lines of this ascending order, how painting is very much material. Music is still material because there are instruments being manipulated. And then poetry is less material still. You're using just sounds. There's nothing even preserved necessarily, if we understand poetry to be originarily a verbal art form, not simply some art form that is preservable in written signs or language. Okay, and then I give you some examples, and so that's what we'll begin with next time. So there's an example of symbolic art, classical art, and romantic art. So at the beginning of class on Thursday, we'll work through those to ensure that we all understand what's going on in terms of these different forms of art that surpass each other historically. And then we'll do some small group discussion, and then we'll get started with the presenters. So I haven't checked actually who's presenting. I took a look at it last week, but I haven't done so again. Let me just.
I know I'm presenting, so I need to reach out to my classmates and get something together.
Okay, so just real quick, let's see. So it is, yeah, Joshua, Tristan. So Tristan is here, Kai is here also, and then Joseph. I don't think Joseph is here, or if he was here today. Yeah, so it's the four of you. So if you have any questions about that, feel free, or issues, feel free to send me an email. I look forward to what you guys have to show, but are there any final questions or comments before we go?
Hegel's awesome.
All right, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Hopefully others did too. But have a good day, and I'll see you all on Thursday.
Sounds good. Thanks, Professor.
Yeah.
Thank you.